This is one of the New York Financial Writers Association's Behind the Story events. This is an event that we hold monthly to really get a sense of the story behind the story of ambitious journalism that we read, and just a chance to hear from the journalists themselves, to hear about where the story came from, what the pitching process was like, the reporting, the research, the writing, really to just kind of have a chance to talk to the reporter who wrote the piece and just ask any questions that come to mind. And tonight I want to say a huge thank you to Ben Dooley of the New York Times, who's joining us from Japan. The piece that Ben wrote, which caught my eye, when did it come out now? It was probably, just looking on the site, back in April of this year, is just a fantastic deep dive into, you know, the corporate culture of 7-Eleven and a clash with a franchisee owner. And as I was reading it, I couldn't help but ask myself, like, where did the idea come from? How did he go about reporting this? What's it like being a business reporter based in Japan for the Times? And, you know, I had all these questions coming up in my own mind. So I reached out to Ben, hoping that he might be willing to join us for one of these events. And we're really lucky to have him. So huge thank you on behalf of the association, Ben, and welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the interest.
Of course. And just usually these events are pretty conversational. They're pretty casual. I'll just ask everyone who's on tonight to mute their microphones so we don't get any interference with background noise. And if any questions come to mind, feel free to either raise your hand or just write them into the chat, and we'll be watching as we move forward. And then there'll also be a Q&A session towards the end of the hour. But to kick off initially, Ben, I was really hoping that you could just give us a bit of background into who you are, how you ended up being a business and economics reporter at the Times.
Sure. Well, I have kind of, I think, a non-traditional background. I was a little late to journalism. I started off as a translator of Japanese, and I was in grad school to study Japanese literature. And one day I went to a talk by actually someone who was a reporter at the New York Times, and thought, oh, that sounds like a lot of fun. And I've been sort of looking for a change in my career path because, frankly, translation was not the most stimulating thing to do. So when I graduated, I looked for a job in journalism and was lucky enough to find one with a Japanese company called Kyoto News, working first as kind of an assistant. So I'm just doing, going to briefings for them and doing transcriptions and things like that. And then sort of worked my way up through the company. They sent me to Beijing to be a correspondent there. And after a year and a half in Beijing, I moved to AFP. And then about 2 years ago to the Times. So that's how I came.
Where are you from?
Sorry?
Where are you from?
I'm from the US, from the Washington DC area.
Okay, so you lived and studied in the US area, and then how old were you when you moved over to Japan?
Well, the first time I went to Japan, I was in college. So I was 19, and I went to Kyoto to study Japanese for a semester. And then after I graduated from school, I came to Japan on what's known as the JET program. It's sort of a Japanese government-run program to bring people to Japan, typically to study, to teach English to Japanese students at schools here. So I was here with them for 2 years, spent another year doing other kind of odd jobs, and then moved into translation after that.
And what was it about journalism that interested you? Like, why? I mean, I think someone who works in translation, there's so many different avenues that you could have gone down. Why did you choose journalism?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm just by nature a curious person and love to ask questions and love to learn. And as I mentioned, I went to this talk, and as I was listening to it, I thought, well, this is just like the perfect opportunity to spend the rest of my life asking people questions and learning about things I don't know about. And I'm kind of a generalist, as I think most journalists are. So it just seemed like such a fun job. It just seemed like something I really wanted to do. And I love to write. So, it was a good match.
Good fit. It says currently that your bio is that you report on Japan's business and economy for the New York Times with a special interest in social issues and the intersections between business and politics. This sounds like such a fascinating beat. How did you come to create a beat like this, and what are the kind of stories that you gravitate towards?
Well, they hired me to write about business. I had been covering mostly politics in China, but politics in China, politics and business are kind of, it's impossible to separate the two. So I ended up writing quite a lot about business interests of politicians in China and the government. So from there, when I moved to the Times, of course, I was still interested in those political issues and the sort of how the impact, I guess, that business, the relationship between business and politics would be the best way to express it, and how that impacts people's daily lives, more than sort of the mechanics of business and finance and things like that. Although that's also something I'm interested in. It was more sort of the social aspects of business and finance and how they impact people that interested me. So those are the kinds of stories that I typically have pursued here. And I think the New York Times in general, the readership it's not really business oriented. So, I mean, we're writing for more of a general audience. So there are people who are not quite so interested in reading about, what happened at, SoftBank's AGM or the more kind of technical stories. So it's been a good fit for me here.
Right. Okay, so let's now dive into this piece, which is why we've got you here tonight. So the title is "A Grudge Match in Japan, One Corner, Two 7-Elevens," and the subhead reads, "Inside the war between a very powerful company and a very stubborn franchisee, complete with threats, spies, and videotape." It's such a compelling way into the piece. I'd love it if you could just explain in your own words, what is this story about for people who may be signing in tonight and haven't had a chance to read it yet?
Well, I guess the first thing to know is that convenience stores are a ubiquitous part of the Japanese landscape. Like literally everywhere you go, there's a convenience store on every corner. And I guess we might not necessarily think of it this way, but as a result, these convenience store companies, the companies that run the shops, are some of the most powerful and influential companies in the country. I mean, the way they run the stores has a real impact on people's daily lives. I mean, just this morning, I went downstairs to a convenience store, the hotel, to buy, things that I need. So, the items, the merchandise they select, how they sell it, all has a really enormous impact on the texture of people's everyday life here. So that was kind of the starting point. I was interested in convenience stores and writing about them and the importance that they hold in kind of the Japanese experience. And of course, obviously, a company like 7-Eleven is international. So I mean, that was an easy company to write about because I think pretty much, certainly in the US, everyone has been into a 7-Eleven or certainly seen one. Is familiar with the company. Mm-hmm. Now, you see an American company, it's now a Japanese company, so that also helped. So at the end of the day, these issues, the conflicts between the company and the franchisees, I think are pretty, say, universal in a way, similar to some issues we're seeing in the US where you have this problem with, say, Uber and drivers, where it's this question of, are the drivers employees or are they, sort of essentially independent business people, right? And it's the same thing that's happening with 7-Eleven, where the franchisees are technically in charge of their own business, but in fact, the company is dictating to them what they can or can't do on almost the micro level, and that, that problem has become a big one in Japan and has become quite a public fight. So it was something that we wanted to really dig into.
Okay, so it sounds like you knew you wanted to write about the convenience store industry and the
Right.
relationship between franchisees and the corporation.
Mm-hmm.
So when you knew the big picture of what you wanted to tackle, what was the next step? How did you go about finding this particular story?
So that's a good question. There's actually a much bigger story behind this that we wanted to report out, but we're not able to because it's difficult to get people to go on the record about their experiences with the company. So what we ended up doing was there's a convenience store union, and we contacted the union and talked to them and said, we're interested in writing about this issue, these conflicts between the franchisees and the owners, and can you help us find some examples that would maybe of people who are willing to go, or some people who would be willing to speak to us, on the record. And that took a while. And while we were doing that, actually, Mr. Matsumoto's case suddenly popped up in the headlines because, as I said, people hear, 7-Eleven in particular, which is the largest convenience store chain in Japan, but convenience stores in general, such an important part of people's lives, and there's so much interest in them that when he said, okay, we're going to be closing the store for several hours a day, it was like this huge act of defiance to this powerful corporation. And of course, a lot of newspapers read about it. So I saw that headline. I thought, okay, this guy's probably the perfect person for us to speak to. So we just called him up, drove to Osaka, and wrote an initial story about him. So this is, I think, the story that we're talking about today is the third story I think I've written about 7-Eleven. Yeah. So we met him for the first time then, and began this conversation that led to the current.
Was there any reluctance to pick up Mr. Matsumoto's story, given it had already been covered by other media? I wonder how the Times views this. Like, is there an element that, or a time where your editor suggested that maybe you should find someone's story who hasn't been covered to try and tell this broader piece that you essentially pitched? Or was it that this is the perfect story and we don't really care the fact that it's been covered before or isn't exactly new?
Well, first of all, it wasn't well covered in the English media. I think that maybe Reuters and possibly Bloomberg had kind of short pieces about it.
Right.
But there wasn't a lot that had been written about it. So I figured it would be pretty easy to do sort of, working for the New York Times, you have the luxury of taking a step back and doing a deeper kind of like longer piece. And that's a huge luxury. I mean, having worked previously at 2 wire services, it's really amazing to have that time and space. So yeah, I figured there was probably, more to the story than just a guy who was saying he wasn't going to, he was going to shut down his store for a few hours a night. And, I think it's a bit easier in a way to find stories as a foreign correspondent than it is when you're working in your own country, because there's so much less attention to the stories, despite the end of the fact that, there are many fewer English correspondents in Japan, obviously, than there are in, Boston or New York or what have you. Yeah.
Right.
So that opens up a lot of space for doing stories, I think, that have actually received some decent attention in Japan. So it's less of a problem.
I think what really makes this story sing is that additional context that you're talking about, and the fact that you really let the writing breathe, and you have these like really good nut graphs that tell the reader, why this matters. Because I feel like a case like this, it would be easy to just write a story straight off the documents about this feud, but you've given readers context as to why it's important. And we see that in the nut graph where you say the conflict's outcome will determine not just who gets to sell rice balls and cigarettes from one tiny patch of asphalt and concrete. It could also have profound implications for 7-Eleven's authority over tens of thousands of franchise shops across Japan, part of a convenience store network so ubiquitous that the government considers it vital to the national infrastructure during emergencies. So it's really interesting to hear the backstory from you that, like, essentially that was the story you wanted to tell, and you found the anecdote to help you tell that piece. And I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about your approach to the framing and tone of the story.
The framing and tone of the story. I mean, as you said, this was a story, we started from the broader context, and looked for something. I mean, I guess I tend to do this here. It's easier to do here in some respects than it might be at home. To look for the big story and then try to find something that I think is going to grab people's kind of fire up their imagination, really grab people's attention or interest. And the idea for me of these two 7-Elevens next to each other, which is kind of so absurd, it just seemed so kind of, I don't know, it just seems so ridiculous in a way and so petty that I thought, okay, this is, even though we'd written about him before, I thought, okay, this is a really good frame for this broader story. But the kind of bigger framing is really has more to do with all the stories we didn't write, I guess. So it's like there was a government panel, for example, that did an inquiry into labor practices at convenience stores in Japan. And had I been working at AFP still, I would have written that day story and just said, like, the report came out today and, the panel said X, Y, and Z, and that could have such and such an impact on, 7-Eleven and other convenience stores. But because at the times they don't tend to do those kinds of day stories unless they're like really, really big stories. It's kind of like taking all of that backstory, all that context, and figuring out how to just, build the anecdotal bits around it, kind of as like the framework. I don't know. That's not a very good answer to your question. I'm sorry. It's like I don't really know how to say how to. I mean, I guess the absurdity of it kind of set the tone for the piece, right? I mean, yeah. And I've been in touch with him consistently from the first time we wrote a story about him. So about a year, I guess.
Right.
And during that time, pieces of the story had kept kind of emerging. So like we got, he gave us a copy of the videos that 7-Eleven had given to his lawyer. Yeah. And
so in the videos, can you see this flying kick and the headbutt?
It's so the videos are taken from, I mean, what apparently happened, and obviously the company didn't tell us, is that they hired a private investigator. We know they hired a private investigator because they told the court, but they didn't say how they got the footage exactly. But you can tell from the video that it's taken from a much taller building, and there's only really one building it could have been taken from. So then it's an apartment building across the street from the 7-Eleven, and it's just a question of which apartment they were in when they took the video. But the point is that it's a wide angle lens that shows the whole parking lot from quite a distance. And you can't really see what's happening. It's all kind of like, blocky. It's difficult to see what's happening. So they say that that's what happened. There are also some videos that were taken with like a hidden camera. They clearly had people in the store. I don't know if they were waiting there for him to do something or if they set him up or what, but there happened to be people in the store during a couple of these incidents when he was yelling at people who were parking in his parking lot when they ought not to have been. And in those, you can clearly see what's happening. With the flying kick in the head, but it's like, okay, maybe you can't really tell. Yeah.
I thought the fact that they hired private investigators was quite bizarre and also quite telling of just how much this case, meant to the company. Is it normal for corporations like 7-Eleven in Japan to hire private investigators in situations like this?
So it's a lot more common than I realized when I came here. I kind of thought in China, you have a lot of issues with surveillance and people, when you're writing stories, the government typically, but sometimes companies as well. That's a big problem. And I sort of thought when I came to Japan, I'd be leaving that behind to some extent. But as it turns out, a lot of big corporations here use those kinds of pressure tactics on people that they don't like for whatever reason. So another big business story when I've been here has been the kind of Carlos Ghosn saga at Nissan. And Nissan also hired private investigators to harass employees that they thought were out of line. So read about that a little bit. I know Bloomberg has also written about it pretty extensively in the Nissan case. but it's a lot more common than I realized.
Mm-hmm.
And 7-Eleven in particular, one of the board members is a former director of Japan's National Police Force.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, I mean, there are a lot of like interesting things going on there that, you know, don't necessarily make it into our stories, but we've had some, with some people that we spoke to who worked at the company, there've been some kind of troubling incidents related to these private security firms and actually the Japanese police as well. So
when you're working on a piece like this that you know the company's not exactly going to be overly happy about, at what point did you reach out to them to tell them that you were writing this, and how much information did you provide?
Well, because we've been writing about this problem, we'd already written about it a few times, and we kind of already knew what they said, and what they were going to say. I typically like to give people as much time to respond as I possibly can. Sometimes, depending on a story like this, for a longer story, it can be a week or weeks even, although weeks is excessive in most cases, but it's happened once or twice. But I think with this case, since it was kind of already pretty well established what had happened and what their position was, and they'd been very public about it, maybe 2 or 3 days notice, and we provided all the details and asked them, you know, what their response was. So typically what I do is I go through every detail that's going to be in the story, and just have a long list of questions. I don't know how many it was in this case, maybe a couple of dozen, and just give them the opportunity to respond to everything point by point. And my experience is that can be very helpful, because sometimes there, you know, despite your best efforts, there are misunderstandings, and sometimes the companies will legitimately actually correct a misunderstanding. Sometimes, of course, they'll just say, "Oh, you're wrong," and when you know for a fact that you're right. But sometimes they do actually make some good points. So I think it's always good to give them the opportunity to respond to everything, so that.
I'm interested in what kind of conversations you had with them after you sent those bullet points, because the one sentence in the story that you know reflects a response from them just says, when approached for comment, a 7-Eleven representative referred reporters to the company's court filings. So did they essentially just not say anything, or did they come back and kind of give you, hey, on background, you know, this is our thoughts on these points, and we're not saying anything on record?
No, they didn't say anything. I mean, I guess particularly because this is dealing with a legal matter that's in the courts, you know, they're really hesitant to say anything, certainly publicly. But just in general, spokespeople at companies here in Japan don't tend to do the whole on background thing.
Right.
That doesn't. I mean, maybe if you have a pre-existing relationship with them, they would. In this case, I don't really. I mean, we have pre-existing relationship in the sense that we've gone to them for comment on a number of occasions, but my efforts to kind of like actually develop a relationship with the people of the offices there have been rebuffed pretty thoroughly. So we don't really, have any kind of like meaningful communication. Yeah.
Right. And you talked a little bit just then about the fact that this case is before the courts, so that made it difficult for them to really say anything. How easy is it in Japan to access those court documents, and how quickly could you get them when you knew you did want to focus on this particular case?
It's actually quite difficult to get court documents in Japan. In theory, it should be easy because they should all be publicly available, at least in a civil case like that. But the reality is that they're not digitized like they would be in the US, so you can't get them online. And in some cases, there's only one physical copy. So if the court needs access to that copy, you can't get them until they're done with it. Right. So you typically have to go through the lawyers, and in a criminal case, they can't share the evidence with you. In a civil case, they can. So in this case, we just went to Mr. Matsumoto's legal team to get access to the documents.
Okay, that's a great segue into my next question, which is Could you describe a little bit your relationship with Mr. Matsumoto, and how much did you prepare him for the string of stories that you did produce around his case?
I mean, the relationship with him, I've met him a handful of times over the last year, and we, have talked just about his situation. He, he has a very strong point of view about what happened, obviously. And I don't, it's difficult to know. Yeah, he's an interesting character. I mean, yeah, he's very outspoken, which is kind of rare, because I guess he kind of got to the point where he felt like he didn't really have anything to lose.
Right.
In a number of these other cases that I would have liked to have written about, which were actually much worse in some ways, the people who were involved were just not willing to speak out. So yeah, in that sense, he's quite an unusual character. As far as preparing him, I mean, he'd already been all over the national media, so he didn't really, I mean, I think when a story like this comes out in the US, it doesn't typically have much effect on the lives of the people who are being discussed in it here in Japan, because it's in English, and people in general here are not really reading the New York Times anyway. I mean, there's some exceptions to that, of course, but yeah, so I think for him, the story didn't really have much of an impact.
How does that impact your own approach to pitching and ideas and what you think you want to focus on? The fact that you're writing for an English-based, like, American publication, the New York Times, how does that change your approach to what you think you should write about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think about that a lot. I guess it comes down to the question is what is the real, kind of job of a foreign correspondent? Is it to explain to people at home what's going on in a country? Is it to, like in China, for example, sorry, just go back to the China example, I think to some extent foreign correspondents, because it's very difficult for Chinese journalists to do any kind of investigative work. Foreign correspondents in China were in some ways writing for a domestic audience as much as they were writing for a foreign audience. Here, I think that's really not so much the case. Investigative reporters are maybe not quite as aggressive as they could be, but in general, I think there's a pretty vibrant kind of style of investigative journalism here, which is it's a healthy field here. So I think a lot of the time for me, I'm trying to write stories that will help people think about things that are going on in the US, maybe, and see them in a different light. I'm always trying to kind of write about things that are happening at home, or give a different perspective on things that are happening at home. So I kind of try to keep an eye, obviously, on what are the big issues in the US right now. And in this particular case, it was a little less so than it might be in other cases. Like when I write about macroeconomics, for example, I'm always trying to think about, okay, so we're working on a story about deflation right now. And the reason why we're going to write that is just because inflation has become such a large topic of conversation at home. So I think for that reason, it's interesting to think about our inflation problem in the US through the lens of like this deflation problem that Japan is dealing with even in the midst of Corona. With 7-Eleven, yeah, it wasn't quite, it was almost a little bit more of a domestic story in a way, but at the same time, I think it does touch on these issues. Again, kind of my touch point was this conflict in California between Uber and the drivers there. We didn't actually mention that in the story, but I think it was relevant. That was one of the reasons why I thought it'd be interesting to write about, but also because I think it does, as I mentioned, really tell you a lot about Japan. And it's something that people maybe don't, when people write about convenience stores in Japan, they might write about how great they are. People have this experience of coming to Japan and Tokyo and going into a convenience store, and it's like, oh, it's so much better than it is at home. But then there's also this kind of like dark side. So it's, I think, interesting for that reason as well.
Yeah, it definitely is. Is it possible for Mr. Matsumoto or anyone to just go and start their own bodega or their own small corner store? Or is the fact that 7-Eleven is so dominant over there mean that that's not really a possibility?
You absolutely can, but it's a lot harder than opening a 7-Eleven. So if you are someone who wants to quit your job, your day job, and start sort of a new life here, opening a convenience store, I mean, the pitch to people who want to become franchisees is this is going to give you independence. You're going to own your own business and you'll be able to set your own hours, take vacations, do all the kinds of things that you couldn't do if you were working at a big Japanese company.
Right.
So that's the attraction for a lot of these franchisees, and many of them don't actually have much or any experience running a small business, so it's their first time. And they're quite dependent on these companies, whether it's 7-Eleven or Lawson's or Family Mart, for guidance about how to operate their businesses. They're not particularly savvy about that. So to some extent, they're kind of like happy to let the company, first of all, they get the brand recognition. So that's pretty much a guarantee that people will come to their shop, which won't necessarily be the case if they open their own bodega. But then they also have that whole infrastructure behind them, and that infrastructure is not just the physical infrastructure, but also kind of like
the supply chain.
Yeah, exactly. And the operating procedures and everything, is already in place. So it's kind of like just this turnkey situation.
Did you feel like the company kind of had a point when you were reading through the lawsuit, that here's this one franchisee owner trying to push back against the 24/7 operations, trying to close the shop when all the others remained open? Could you understand why the corporation might say, well, we're going to revoke your contract if you're going to do that because everyone else does it this way, and we're going down a slippery slope. If we let one franchisee change the rules, then all of a sudden they all might try and set their own hours.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. I mean, I don't think that 7-Eleven is like an evil company and I'm like out to get 7-Eleven or anything like that. I mean, it's a complicated issue for sure. But at the end of the day, I think the consensus and, the Japanese Trade Commission came to the same conclusion, is that these practices are unfair. This is not the only, this issue of the hours of operation isn't the only like major problem that convenience stores have been having. There's also issues involved with pricing. So, for example, there was a situation where the company was not allowing franchisees to sell expired goods or goods that were going to expire at a discount. So there was no way, say you have like a sandwich or something on your shelf and it's expired. It's just expired. Maybe it's good for its shelf life is 2 days or whatever. So you want to sell it at a 50% discount. You weren't allowed to do that for ages. People were just like throwing away tons of food. And the company, because of the way its business is structured, it makes its profits both when the franchisees buy the products and when they sell them. So there's a big incentive for the company to oversell, kind of upsell the franchisees. So they were creating the situation where they were selling people a lot more product than they actually needed, and sort of, let's say, encouraging them to buy a lot more product than they actually needed. And then they'd end up throwing a lot of it away. And these people were, profits were going to the company, but the franchisees themselves were actually losing money on a lot of these sales. So, there are a number of big problems that have been kind of, I guess, motivated by the company's desire to increase its profits. And it's essentially been pushing the costs onto the franchisees. And I mean, this issue of 24-hour operation is another example of that exact situation. Because for the franchisees, for many of the franchisees, I mean, if you're in the heart of Tokyo until, the corona virus you probably had an incentive to stay open 24 hours a day. But if you're, in the countryside somewhere, no one's really going after midnight, So it's all cost to you to stay open 24 hours because you still have to hire the employee. You still have to, and if you can't find employees, which is often the case with these smaller places that are in depopulating, countryside kind of rural locations, then you have to work yourself. So you have a situation where people are working, sometimes because 7-Eleven will only allow families to open franchises, not just 7-Eleven, all the convenience stores. So you can't, as a single person, open a franchise. You have to have a family member who's in it with you or a partner. And one of the reasons for that, ostensibly, is so that they'll always have staff at the store. So you have this situation where couples will be working 12 hours on, the husband will be 12 hours on, and then, the wife will be 12 hours on.
Is that different to here? I don't think I've heard of that policy here.
I don't think that it's legal in the US. I'm not entirely sure. Although if you talk to franchisees, and I encourage people who are interested in the subject to seek out franchisees in the US, because after I started writing about 7-Eleven here, I got a lot of letters from people in the US saying that they're having similar problems, and that 7-Eleven is trying to kind of bring the Japanese operation model to the US. And the union there is the franchisees union there is quite upset about it. So it's actually a really good story, I think, in the US as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That also touches on another theme in your piece where you talk about how this particular story hit a nerve in Japan where overwork is rampant and sometimes fatal. So was that another element, I guess you could call it the framing or of your mindset as you approach this story, is trying to highlight like the reasons behind Mr. Matsumoto's claim and why it did strike a chord with so many people and other franchisee owners?
Yes, and that's a much bigger problem across the industry. And this was kind of what I was interested in writing about initially, but we haven't been able to get really anyone to go on the record about it. There have been a lot of, and I'm not saying it's the company's fault. It's just I think it's part of the overall work culture here, as mentioned in the story. But there have been a lot of cases of people collapsing on the job at 7-Elevens and other convenience stores, Lawson's, Family Mart, what have you. Even people dying.
Wow.
And yeah, it's it's always hard to say what the cause of that is. You can never say for sure, but it's happened enough in these situations where people are working really long hours that it does raise some questions.
You mentioned, and you flipped at this a little bit in our conversation, there was the broad inquiry by the Fair Trade Commission in Japan that concluded the convenience store industry's 24-hour-a-day policy was unsustainable. Did that report by the commission come about after this case or because of this case?
It came about in part because of this case. Also, there's a small franchisees union, and they've been quite vocal about these issues, although they've met a lot of resistance, obviously, from the companies. In fact, it took a while for them to get a union together because the first few attempts were kind of thwarted by the companies. So it's a relatively recent development that there is even a union. A lot of these cases about people collapsing in stores had become national news or had made it into the news. A lot about the issue of people throwing food away. Food waste became like a huge topic of discussion here as well. I think a number of different factors all kind of came together. And it's just also, kind of reflects just general trends in Japan with an aging population, diminishing workforce.
With the people collapsing on the job and in some cases dying on the job, if they've been covered by other media, what's stopping you from just reaching out to in those particular cases, or are they never identified?
Some of them were quite old, and the more recent ones didn't want to speak to us for reasons I won't speculate on.
Right. You think that any of those reasons, and I mean, you don't have to talk about this particular case, but has to do with a reluctance of talking to a foreign correspondent representing an American media outlet? Like, would they be more willing to speak to a local publication than someone from the Times?
No, I don't think that had anything to do with it.
Okay. So if you know that this is happening and you know this is an area you want to look into, as an investigative journalist, what are some other potential avenues of trying to find some of these cases that you could go down? If, like, rather than just kind of looking at what's been covered by other outlets, where are other, are there any other sources or documents that you could try and seek?
Yeah, well, their lawyers are quite active on these cases, so we're in touch with them. The union, again, in this case, is, I think, a good source of information. Although, I mean, the issue with the union is that a lot of those cases, people want to talk to the union, but they don't want their stories to be public.
Right.
And same thing with lawyers, of course, as well. So you kind of have to find that sweet spot between someone who has a really good story and also, is so fed up that they're willing to actually have their name in the paper, which I think most people, and they're not wrong to do this necessarily. I mean, I completely understand the reasons why they do, but most people are holding out hope that they can kind of negotiate something quietly, a settlement, or come to some kind of satisfactory agreement with the company without, making it public. And I think that's a very reasonable and understandable thing to do. So it's, that, not great for me, but great for good for them if it works.
And I guess that's why Mr. Matsumoto is so unique in some respects, because towards the end of the story, you write about, the big amounts of money that the company is trying to encourage him to settle, $92,000 to drop his case, and they've just increased it again. And his response was, it's not about the money, it's about something bigger. But there'd be very few people who would have this similar mindset to him, I can imagine, in a situation like this.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think even if people feel that way, I mean, even if they do feel it's a bigger principle at stake, they might not have, understandably, I mean, it's a scary thing to do, the courage to go up against like a big company like 7-Eleven. Yeah, I mean, it's a frightening thing, I think.
Definitely.
Not frightening because, the company is like out to get them, but, I mean, just have your name on the national stage.
To go up against a company that, has such deep pockets when you're just an individual.
Yeah, and you never know what kind of, not all the attention to Mr. Matsumoto and outside of the company has been positive. A lot of people are very critical of him. Right. And they feel like, hey, if you signed up for this, knowing what you're getting into, what right do you have to complain? Or, those sorts of comments, you see them on Twitter, for example, quite a lot. So.
And what is his response to that been?
He doesn't. I don't think he cares. He has a very strong sense of what it is that he's trying to accomplish and set out to do. So,
right,
doesn't let it bother him, I think.
Nice.
Kind of enjoys it, actually, maybe.
I just want to remind everyone on the call that we're going to open this up to questions. If anyone has a particular question for Ben or something that they want to discuss, feel free to pop it in the chat. And I see one's come through from William Friedman. He says, it seems like a lot of the story never got past the editorial process. In this digital age, was space really such a consideration?
Well, I'm curious to know, when you say a lot of the story, the short answer to your question is yes, it is. We do still have physical paper, so we do think about space quite a lot. Sometimes maybe more than is strictly necessary. So yes, we have pretty tight word limits typically, even for big enterprise stories.
And are you working with just an editor based in Japan, or do you have editors based over here as well?
So we actually have editors in Seoul. We have a whole team, kind of a regional hub in Seoul, editors there, and I work with one person who is kind of my main chief, I guess editing partner, and then a business editor and someone who's responsible for the region.
Mm-hmm. For a question for, people who may be interested in going down the foreign correspondence path, do you think it would be possible to do the kind of stories that you do if you couldn't speak Japanese?
Yeah, definitely. It's possible. I mean, there are lots of foreign correspondents who don't speak the language of the country where they're based. I mean, I think that it's less common now than it used to. And definitely one of the reasons why I was hired for this job was because I speak Japanese, unquestionably. I mean, they were looking for someone who speaks Japanese, but I mean, I think if you wanted to work in China, you would have to speak Chinese, speak the language. But depending on the country, yeah, it's not necessarily a requirement. But I think typically, if you wanted to do that, you'd have to be pretty well established already in the US. The people that I know who are in a country where they don't speak the language, it's either because there are very few people who outside of that country who speak the language. It's quite an unusual skill to have, or they were already very well established journalists before they went abroad.
Right. If you could give like a couple of pieces of advice to people who may be interested in foreign correspondence, what, like one or two pieces of advice that you wished someone had told you before you started out?
That's a tough one. I don't know. It's such a weird kind of like pocket of the universe. Yeah, I don't know. And in my particular experience is so idiosyncratic. I think it's really hard to. I mean, I've had a couple of people ask me, how do I get into this work, and I mean, the answer is like, for me, it's like be lucky enough to be born into a family where your parents were like solidly middle class, and you could afford to have work for basically peanuts at a company that right. I mean, and then have lots of lucky breaks, and I mean, it's difficult. Yeah, it's not a path that can be easily repeated. And I don't know, as far as advice goes, it's tough. I mean, I guess the thing that I would say, this is kind of difficult advice, maybe because it's language specific, but I think that especially when I started as a foreign correspondent, a lot of people weren't thinking about the kinds of documents that are available in other countries. And you can do a lot of research in other countries from the US about things that are going on here, especially now, with auto translate and all sorts of tools like that. It's amazing the kinds of access you can get to documents in other countries. And like, I think China was, for me, one of the most surprising places, because the level of transparency in China is shockingly high. I know that's weird to hear because you hear so much about how opaque everything is there. But in some respects, in some very specific respects, there's an insane amount of information available in China about certain things, like companies.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, companies, corporate registers. I don't know if this is true anymore, but certainly when I arrived, like, it was way easier to get information about companies in China than it would be in the US, for example. You could get complete lists of shareholders. You could get, like the whole basically registry, corporate registry was available to anyone from the public who wanted to see it, with really detailed information. And I think that's still true to an extent, although it's much more difficult to get your hands on that kind of information now than it used to be.
Right.
But yeah, so it's always good to, I guess, not make assumptions about the kinds of things that wouldn't be available to you. Just try to, when you're approaching a story in another country, make a list of a wish list of all the things that you'd want to get. Do you know what I mean? Because sometimes you'll be surprised by which of those things that you may not be able to get in the US, you can actually get very easily somewhere else.
Right. Would you advise someone who is American and based here, who has a dream to one day be doing something like what you're doing right now and wants to go to Japan, that they should start pitching and thinking about stories based over there, even while they're in the US, to try and kind of create a pathway going forward, or what's the normal recruiting process for foreign correspondents in places like that?
I really don't know what the normal process is. I can't speak to that at all. I think it's a great idea. Yeah, I mean, I think there are definitely stories that you can do from anywhere, related to Japan or to, I mean, especially if you speak the language, but you don't necessarily have to. And to the extent that you can do document-based stories, yeah, I mean, in theory, you should be able to do those. Maybe not so much the case in Japan, because as I said, it's quite difficult to get, for example, court documents, unless you go in person, and even then.
Right.
But in a lot of other places, yeah, I mean, I think you can definitely come up with story ideas and pitch them. And there's some money available for reporting in Japan. So I think if people are interested in coming here to do work, it's possible to find grants or other kinds of means for getting over here.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. So we have another question coming through from Carolyn Sargent. She's asking, what's the balance or tension between stories you want to report versus the stories your editors want to cover?
Yeah, I feel I'm pretty lucky being at the Times again, because it's a pretty reporter-driven kind of newsroom. So, I mean, I'd say probably 80% of the stories that I write are stories that I pitch.
Nice.
I'm interested in. Yeah, so I get, for the most part, a lot.
And the other 20%, where do they come from?
Yeah, maybe 10% are from editors, and the other 10% are kinds of just things that are just huge news stories that you have to cover.
Right.
Yeah.
And John Beers is asking, what's the state of investigative journalism in Japan? Is there the equivalent of ProPublica or other nonprofit investigative outfits like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, investigative journalism here is fairly robust. I think personally, I mean, having worked in the Japanese media, I was really impressed by the caliber of the investigative reporters that I encountered and do encounter here. I think there's sometimes a bit of a hesitancy to dig into certain topics when they touch upon certain sensitive political issues or certain businesses. I feel like sometimes people feel like they need permission to get into some of those issues. Mm-hmm. And it's really more of a cultural thing, I think, than anything else. It's not necessarily, I mean, there is of course pressure behind the scenes sometimes, but in general, I'd say it's pretty, as I said, robust. And there are nonprofit organizations, although they're not really on the same scale as like a ProPublica yet, but they're building up and had some pretty good successes here. So there's definitely a lot of interest in kind of replicating that model. And a few years ago, they started in a kind of an investigators, reporters, and editors type style, conference here styled on that, which has been pretty successful. I went 2 years ago, and there was a really big turnout and a lot of interest.
Great. And were the reporters attending that conference? Were they coming from the local outlets like TV, radio, and newspaper all across the board?
Yes. So it was sort of a mix of a variety of different people. Some lawyers who are active in kind of the media sphere, freedom of information, that kind of stuff. Local newspapers, or regional sort of newspapers and TV outlets, and then kind of the big outlets here, like your NHK or your national level, newspapers, Asahi Shimbun, Yomiuri, for example. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. And I just want to send a reminder out. We've only got Ben for another 5 minutes. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in. I had another question for you, which was about your writing process. I always love to ask reporters, like, how do you go about actually writing once you've been researching for a while? That this isn't, this area, this theme is something that you want to focus on. You find the case study. What do you do when you sit down to actually write the story out?
Yeah, I wish I had a sort of a systematic approach to doing that. Unfortunately, I just kind of sit down at the computer and think, oh God, I have to get this done in the next 24 hours, and then desperately write as quickly as I can. Yeah, I mean, I typically, I know how. I guess a sandwich, with the anecdote lead and kind of kicker, and then do the kind of context, the drier parts sort of in the middle. And the theory that people will be so intrigued by the lead that they'll, read through. But it's an iterative process. I don't know. I don't know how to.
You had two little gems in there that I noticed as I was reading through. One was you wrote, before his seemingly small act of rebellion, the company had deemed him praise for, among other things, having the highest sales of steamed pork buns in the region, which I just think is like such a great little addition to the story, that fact. And then you also wrote about how while he was watching a crane do excavation work on the parking lot, a passing by cyclist stopped to share a few words of encouragement, urging Mr. Matsumoto not to let the big guys win. Mm-hmm. As you're reporting pieces like this, how do you identify those kind of little nuggets of information that really bring a story to life?
It's going to sound kind of weird, but it's just the things that stick in my mind after, however many days of reporting. When I start writing, it's like there are always a few elements that have kind of stuck with me and I think about, and those are the ones that I try to use as the details. Because I mean, it may sound sort of tautological, but if I forget it, it's forgettable, right? So
that's nice. And we have another question here from Caroline. She's asking, how large does Masayoshi's son loom in Japanese business media and consciousness? SoftBank has a huge footprint globally, but is there the same awareness of him in Japan? Great question.
Yeah, he's an icon. I mean, I would say that, he's a very prominent figure here, for sure. I mean, he's considered kind of a bit of an oddball, I guess. He doesn't behave in what I guess would be sort of the typical way that a Japanese executive would be expected to behave. I mean, he's not quite like Elon Musk level, definitely out of the mainstream. But I mean, he's enormously successful and hugely influential. But yeah, I mean, I think he's kind of in some ways seen as a bit of an outsider, despite being Japanese. And there are a lot of reasons for that. It's also partly, I think, because he's ethnically Korean, which has sort of a whole baggage attached to it here in Japan. But yeah, it's a huge company and very influential.
Mm-hmm. And then just the last question for you, Ben, is what did you hope was the takeaway from this story?
The takeaway from this story, in what sense do you mean? Like for readers, or?
Yeah, for readers. What did you hope was like what they were left thinking about after they finished reading it?
Yeah, well, no, I hope that readers, the next time they walk into a convenience store or some kind of service industry oriented, business anywhere, like really think about a little bit more about, what's going on, what it is that makes that business run, and what's going on behind the scenes, and the people who are working there. And again, with Japan, we talk a lot about, when people come to visit, they talk a lot about the convenience of these places, but they really don't think of the cost of that convenience. So I guess I was hoping that people would reflect on that a little bit.
Yeah, that's great. I love that, the cost of that convenience. That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for all your time and all your insights and answering all of our questions. That was a really interesting session. And thanks to all of those who joined us tonight, and for Britt for helping pull this event together. We really appreciate it. And thanks again, Ben.